In a way, we just heard a classic expression of the idealist tradition in foreign policy, but it has at its core your scenario that Ukraine becomes a NATO member, which we've heard a number of times today is a goal of Ukrainian policy. And that brings me very naturally back to you, Condi. Obviously, you were present at not the creation, but at the enlargement of NATO, and you must have pondered often in these past 2.5 years about whether we might be in a different world if Ukrainian membership of NATO had happened. How do you think about that now? And do you think it is realistic today to speak of NATO accession for Ukraine?
Well, Neil, I'm going to take the advantage here, the possibility of making 4 quick points, and I'll come back to the last one about Ukraine and NATO. The first that I want to make is that, we haven't talked much about Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare and or worst scenario. Now, I do think that his best scenario was not achieved. He thought that within 5 days he was going to eliminate an independent Ukraine, and he failed at that. And so now the question about scenarios may be how to make his worst case scenario, which is that he really pays an enormous price for what he's done, to come into being. And one of the things that I would strongly suggest is that rather than sort of, again, grand scenarios, to become very granular about how to erode his international support. Support from China, support from North Korea, support from Iran. Because I think when you have Vladimir Putin going to Pyongyang, that suggests that maybe Russia's not in quite a strong position as some have suggested. And so I think some scenario planning on how to further weaken Russia's hand might be in order. I say that as an old Russianist who often thinks that Russia has some strengths, but it has some significant weaknesses as well. Secondly, I would say that as to scenarios in general, in 1989, I became the young Soviet specialist for George H.W. Bush. My guess is that in February of 1989, the one scenario we would not have planned for was a completely united Germany, fully and completely within NATO. Scenarios can only show you so much of the future. And so while it's good to do scenario planning, particularly on very specific issues, the one scenario that you probably haven't thought of is likely to be the one that comes into being. I would not have guessed that a year later, Germany would be fully united and within NATO. The third point that I want to make, and this leads to your question about Ukrainian security, is about U.S. politics. It may be that we end up with a president who will get out of NATO, decide that Ukraine is not worth it, et cetera, et cetera. But Neil, you made a very important point about U.S. politics. Very often policy is personnel, and you need to watch some of the people who are players, even on the Trump side, and what they are saying about the criticality of this war to U.S. interests. Because rightly, this has to be an argument about how it affects U.S. interest. And I think the strongest argument is the one that we've been hearing, that a world in which a large neighbor can extinguish its smaller neighbor is not a world in which we will want to live. I think it's also an argument that every time the United States has tried to ignore what is going on in Europe, we have been dragged in, whether it was into World War I or World War II, or frankly, what happened to us on September 11th when we thought that the fight was out there and it turned up being in American cities. The third argument that I would make to the American people is that we cannot separate what is happening in the Middle East after October 7th because of the Iranian hand in that from what is happening in the Indo-Pacific with China's aggression and what is happening in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, the mullahs in Iran are all after the same thing. That is to overthrow the international order as we have known it, and as the last speaker said, to replace democracy with authoritarianism worldwide. And so I think that's an argument that the American people will understand. And it's why I'm not as pessimistic about the American political scene and its reaction, whoever is in the White House. And then the final point is about Ukrainian security. I was at Bucharest in 2008. Nobody argued more strongly for membership action plan for NATO than President Bush and the Bush administration and I personally. I remember those long arguments with the Germans and with others, with the East Europeans saying something that turned out to be true, that if we left a vacuum in Europe without Ukraine with a clear road to NATO membership, we would pay a price for it. The Poles said that. The Baltic states said that. They were right. And I do wish we had been able to bring Ukraine closer to NATO and on a path to membership at that point. That's behind us. I personally will be arguing for Ukraine to accede to NATO. I think that's the best answer. I think it does not leave a vacuum. Vladimir Putin, I do not believe, wants any part of the countries that have an Article 5 commitment. And so, yes, I will argue for NATO accession, for Ukraine accession to NATO. Whether or not it can get done, that's another question. But I think the argument has to be made, the argument has to be joined. And if we can make the argument that it is also in the U.S. national interest that there not be a vacuum in Europe into which aggression can once again flow, then maybe we have a chance.
Connie, thank you so much. I know you have to leave now. Please, a round of applause for Secretary Condoleezza Rice.